nobody stopped him. That was the thing Helen Johnson would never forget. Not the pain. She had learned to absorb pain the way dry ground absorbs rain, quickly, without trace. Not the shame of strangers watching. What she would never forget was the silence. The way an entire market full of people simply decided, in that collective, cowardly instant, that what was happening to her was not their problem. Emeka's hand connected with the side of her face so hard, she hit the market stall behind her, oranges scattering across wet pavement, her 3-year-old daughter Amara screaming against her shoulder, and nobody moved. Not one person. Nobody except the man stepping out of the black SUV across the street. She didn't know who he was. She didn't know his name, or what he controlled, or the way certain people in Seoul went quiet when they heard it. She only saw a man in a grey coat walking toward her husband with the absolute unhurried calm of someone who has never once needed to raise his voice to end a situation. And she thought, instinctively, this man is either going to save me or make everything much worse. She was right about the first part. She had no idea yet about the second. His name was Kang, 40 years old, CEO of Kwon International on paper, something considerably more complicated in the world beneath that paper, a network of influence that moved quietly through the gaps between law and power, built over 15 years and maintained through a combination of intelligence, loyalty, and the kind of controlled ruthlessness that men with less discipline called violence. His people called him Guishin, the ghost. Not because he hid, but because by the time you understood what he'd done, it was already permanent. He had come to Gwangjang Market to deal with a supplier problem. He had not come to intervene in a domestic dispute on a wet October morning. But then he heard the child scream, that particular frequency of terror that only children make, and something in Kang Kwon shifted like a tectonic plate, and his hand was on the door before his mind had approved the motion. He crossed the street. Emeka was still talking, the cold, satisfied kind of talking that some men do after they've hit someone, as if the hit were a punctuation mark, and now they're continuing the sentence. When Kang appeared behind Helen like a change in weather. "That is enough," Kang said. 2 words, quiet as a closed door. The market went still. Emeka turned. He was broad and red-faced and accustomed to being the largest presence in any room, and he looked at this stranger with the particular contempt of a man who hasn't yet correctly identified what he's dealing with. "Who are you? This is between me and my wife. Walk away." Kang said nothing. He simply looked at Emeka with those dark, flat eyes, the eyes of a man who has looked at genuinely dangerous things and found them manageable. And Emeka, to his credit, felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. He felt afraid, and he didn't know why, and that made him angrier. "I said walk! I heard you," Kang said. He reached into his coat and produced a card, held it out with 2 fingers. "My lawyer. Call him. Tell him you're ready to begin divorce proceedings, or I'll be making that call for you before the end of the week." A pause. "Either way, we're done here." Emeka looked at the card, looked at the 2 large men who had materialized at the edge of the scene like weather systems, looked back at Kang's face, which had not moved at all, and found nothing there to negotiate with. He took the card. He looked at Helen once, a look full of promises he was no longer positioned to keep, and he left. Kang turned to Helen for the first time. She was already looking at him. Her cheek was burning, her daughter was trembling against her neck, and she was standing straight, her chin lifted, her eyes sharp. Not grateful, not frightened, but evaluating. Taking him apart to see what he was made of. He respected that immediately. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "I'm fine," she said, the automatic answer, the practiced one. He glanced at Amara, still shaking in her mother's arms, and then back at Helen's face. The older bruise beneath the new one, the careful concealer, the geography of a life lived under someone else's fist. "Your daughter is shaking," he said quietly. "Let me take you somewhere safe. No conditions. Just safe." She looked at him for a long moment, testing the offer for hooks, finding, unexpectedly, none. "Okay," she said, so quietly it barely existed. He nodded once and turned toward the car. He installed her in an apartment in Yongsan the following week. He hired a lawyer. He enrolled Amara in daycare. He did all of this efficiently and without fanfare, and he kept his distance. No visits unless invited, no calls except for practical matters. He sent things through his lieutenant, Sung Jae, groceries, a children's book in English and Korean, once a sealed container of doenjang jjigae left with the concierge. No note. Helen called him on the third week. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. Direct. She didn't soften it. A pause. "Because I can," he said. "And because—" Another pause, shorter, like he'd almost stopped himself. Someone should have done it sooner. She didn't thank him. She said, "I'm going to pay you back." Flat and certain. Something about the certainty almost made him smile. "All right," he said. "I mean it." "I know," he said. "That's why I almost believe you." She hung up before he could hear whether that made her laugh. It was Amara who broke him open. 6 weeks in, Kang arrived at the apartment with a document that needed signing, something related to the lease transfer, and was met at the door not by Helen, but by a 3-year-old in a yellow dress who looked up at him and said, in careful, deliberate Korean she'd clearly been rehearsing, "안녕하세요. 저는 아마라예요." Kang crouched to her level. Something structural happened in his chest. "Hello, Amara," he said in English. "Your Korean is very good." "I know," she said, without false modesty. She examined him. "Are you sad?" He blinked. "What?" "You look like people look when they're sad but trying not to," she said. "Mama looked like that before. She doesn't look like it as much now." Kang was quiet for a moment. He had survived boardrooms and backroom negotiations and things considerably darker than both. He had not expected to be accurately diagnosed by a 3-year-old in a yellow dress. "Maybe a little," he said honestly. She nodded, satisfied by this answer. "Do you want to come in? Mama made food." He stood up. Helen was in the kitchen doorway with a dish towel and an expression he was still learning how to read. Amusement and something warmer, something careful. "She invited you," Helen said. "You can say no." "I don't want to say no," he said. He stayed for 3 hours. No document was signed. Amara taught him a card game that had rules only she fully understood, and which she changed whenever she was losing. Helen made jollof rice, and they ate at the small table and talked. About Lagos and Seoul, about nursing school, about the kind of small, ordinary things that feel significant when you've been starved of ordinary for too long. When he left, Sung Jae looked at his face and said, very carefully, "You stayed 3 hours." There was a document. Kang looked at the city through the car window. He had spent 4 years building walls with the architectural commitment of a man who intended never to need warmth again. 4 years since Soyeon. 4 years of controlled, sufficient, managed. And in 3 hours at a small kitchen table, something had been quietly, completely dismantled. "Don't say anything," he told Sung Jae. Sung Jae said nothing, but he was smiling, and he didn't bother to hide it. If this story is hitting different right now, stay with me, because this is the moment everything starts to collapse. Subscribe if you haven't. You're going to want to be here for what comes next. The threat arrived gift-wrapped in a pleasant voice. A man fell into step beside Helen outside the market, dressed too well, smile too smooth, the kind of man whose danger is sewn into the lining where you can't see it until it's too late. He introduced himself as Chairman Han Jae-won, business associate of Kang's, concerned friend. He told her things about what Kang was, about the network, the history, the violence, about Soyeon's death, not exactly an accident. When he finished, the apartment was very quiet. Helen said, "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you deserve to know who I am before you decide whether to keep knowing me." His jaw was tight. His eyes were entirely steady. "And because I cannot lie to you. I've tried. It turns out I'm not capable of it." She stood up, went to the kitchen counter, made 2 cups of tea, the ritual of it, the warmth, the thinking, and set one in front of him and sat back down. "Han Jae-won wants something from you," she said. "Yes." "And he thinks going through me will get it." "Yes." His expression darkened. "Which is my fault. I should have—" "Stop!" She looked at him. "Stop explaining what you should have done. Tell me what we're going to do." He looked at her. At the we. Something moved in his face. "I'm going to handle Han," he said. "And Amika?" "He's been quiet, but Attorney Shin said—" "I know what Shin said." His voice went flat in that particular way that meant he had already been thinking about it. "Amika is not going to be a problem much longer." "Kang?" She said his name carefully. "I don't want anyone hurt." He looked at her for a long moment. "I know," he said. "I'll be careful." A pause. "But I will not let them use you. That is not negotiable." She looked back at him, at the controlled stillness, the controlled danger, the eyes that held all of it contained and directed and, somehow, completely trustworthy. "Then be careful," she said. "Come back in one piece." "I always do," he said, and picked up the tea she'd made him. Here is what Kang Kwon did not tell her. He did not tell her that the confrontation with Han Jae-won, the private restaurant meeting, the ultimatum, the leveraged communication records, had gone cleanly, but not without cost. Han had agreed. Han had backed down. But Han was not a man who accepted defeat gracefully, and Kang's intelligence told him within 48 hours that Han had made a call to a government official, to a regulatory body that was designed to do what personal pressure hadn't. An investigation. A formal inquiry into Kwon International's licensing structure in 3 provinces. Not fatal, but expensive, time-consuming and, most significantly, public. Kang sat in his office for an hour after he received this news. His legal team wanted to respond. His financial advisors wanted to negotiate. His shadow network operatives were waiting for instructions that would produce a faster and less clean resolution. He picked up the phone. He called Sung Jae. "Pull everyone back," he said. "No countermoves. We go through the lawyers. Full compliance, full transparency, every record open." A pause. Everything above the table. Silence from Sung Jae. Then, "Kang si, that could take 18 months. The cost." "I know." "There are faster ways." "I know there are." He was looking out the window at the city. "I'm not using them." He paused. "There's a woman. There's a child. There's going to be. There are people I am responsible for now who cannot afford to have the things I've done follow them." His voice was even, certain. "So we do this correctly, whatever it costs." Sung Jae was quiet for a moment. Then, "Understood. I'll make the calls." Kang put the phone down. He sat in his office for another hour, the most expensive hour of his professional life, in terms of what it was going to cost him to do the right thing. He thought about Helen at the kitchen table, making tea for a man whose hands were not clean. He thought about Amara asking if he was sad. Then he picked up the phone again and called his lawyer, and he began the long, costly, honest work of becoming someone worth the trust he'd been given. He told Helen about the investigation on a Sunday morning. No softening, just facts, what Han had done, what it would cost, how long it would take, what he'd chosen not to do about it. She listened. Then, "You chose the harder way." "Yes." "Because of us." He looked at her. "Because it was right," he said. "You being in my life made it clearer. What right looks like. What I want to be able to say, I am." A pause. "So yes, because of you." She was quiet for a moment. Then she reached across the table and put her hand over his. He looked down at her hand on his, at the simple, enormous fact of it. "I'm in love with you," she said, quietly and without decoration. "I've been trying not to say it for weeks because I thought the timing was wrong, and because I was afraid of what I was feeling, and because... Helen. I have very bad history with trusting men and... Helen." She stopped. "I know," he said. "I've been trying not to say it longer than you have." His hand turned beneath hers and held it. "I think I fell in love with you in the market. Not because you needed saving, but because you didn't. Not really. You were already standing up. I wanted to stand beside you." He looked at her with those eyes that had stopped hiding. "I still do. If you'll let me." The city outside made its ordinary sounds. The apartment was warm. Amara was in the next room singing something she'd invented in 3 languages. "I'm pregnant," Helen said. The room changed. "It's yours," she said, before he could speak. "I worked out the timing wrong at first, but I confirmed it. It's yours." Kang Kwon sat very still. She watched something move across his face, all the controlled layers shifting at once, something raw and young and completely unguarded, coming up through all of it like light through ice. "Say something," she said softly. "We're having a child," he said, like he was testing whether the words were real. "Yes." He stood up and came around the table and knelt in front of her chair. This powerful, careful, complicated man, on his knees in a small apartment kitchen. And he took her face in his hands with a gentleness that had clearly always existed in him, buried under everything, waiting for somewhere safe to surface. "I will spend the rest of my life," he said, "being worth this." She leaned her forehead against his. They stayed like that for a long time, in the warmth of the apartment, while outside the city moved around them, indifferent and enormous, not knowing and not caring that in this small kitchen, two broken things had just finished becoming whole. Can we take a second? Because this right here is why we tell these stories. If this is hitting you somewhere real, please share it. Somebody needs this today. They married in April. A small ceremony in a hanok courtyard in Hanamdong, flowering trees dropping pale pink blossoms in the warm wind. Helen's mother flew in from Lagos with 3 bags of spices and the kind of authority that didn't need translation. Kang's sister Ji-yeon arrived from Busan and spent an entire afternoon alone with Helen and emerged from it having clearly decided everything was as it should be. Sung-jae wore a suit that fit him too well and spent most of the ceremony looking at the sky with suspicious brightness in his eyes. Amara was the flower girl. She took the responsibility with surgical seriousness, distributing petals with precision, pausing to evaluate and redistribute when she felt the coverage was uneven. She was wearing yellow. When Helen walked across the courtyard toward him, her mother's lace worked into a dress of deep gold and cream, moving through falling blossoms. Kang stood beneath the flowering trees and watched her come and felt, for the first time since he was a young man, like the future was something to move toward instead of manage. She reached him. He took her hands. "I had 3 paragraphs memorized," he said quietly, for her alone. "And?" "I've forgotten all of them." His hands tightened around hers. "You undo me. Completely. I spent 20 years building something that couldn't be reached, or hurt, or surprised. And you, without trying, without even knowing, you took it all apart." A pause. "I'm grateful. That's all I have. I am so grateful." Her eyes were full. She didn't look away. "Kwon Kang," she said softly, "you crossed a street for a woman you didn't know. That's who you are, underneath everything. That's who I love." She squeezed his hands. "Don't you ever stop being that person." "Never," he said. Their son was born in August, at 4 in the morning, while summer rain ran down the hospital windows. Kang held her hand through all of it and said nothing except what she needed. "I'm here. I'm right here." An anchor she could come back to. When the doctor placed the baby in his arms for the first time, Kang went very still. 8 pounds 4 ounces, dark hair, his mother's eyes. A small, perfect person who had no idea yet what the world contained. He looked up and found Helen watching him from the bed. Exhausted, luminous, smiling. "His name," she said. They had argued and laughed and made lists for weeks. In the end, Kang had come to her 3 days before the birth with one word: quietly. She had said yes immediately. "Eze," he said, the Igbo word for king. And Jisoo. He looked down at the baby. Eze Jisoo Kwon. Amara appeared in the doorway. Apparently her sleep across her grandmother's lap had been strategic and temporary. Climbed onto the bed beside her mother and looked at the baby with the serious assessment of someone evaluating a new business partner. "He's very small," she said. "He'll grow," Kang said. "Can I hold him?" Kang placed the baby in her arms with the concentration usually reserved for highly sensitive materials. Amara looked down at her brother. The baby looked up at her with the unfocused wonder of the newborn, discovering the world. "Hello, Eze," she said, very seriously, in Korean. "Annyeong. I'm your sister. I'm going to teach you everything." There is a version of this world where a man stays in his car, where the crowd watches and looks away, and the woman picks up her oranges from the wet pavement alone and goes home to the life that is hurting her, and nobody crosses the street. That version exists. It happens everywhere, every day. It is the version the world defaults to when people decide that someone else's pain is not their problem. But there is also this version, where a man hears a child scream and something in him decides, before his mind catches up, that he is not going to stay in the car. Where a woman who has learned to make herself small starts, slowly, in the warmth of someone else's belief in her, to take up the space she was always supposed to occupy. Where a little girl in a yellow dress asks a closed man if he is sad, and he says a little, and she says, "Come in, Mama made food." And somehow, that is the whole story. Kang Kwon had been called Gwishin, the ghost, something that moved without being seen. He was not a ghost anymore. He came home every evening to a table full of noise, his mother-in-law's cooking filling the apartment, Amara doing her homework in 3 languages simultaneously, his son making the urgent questioning sound of new babies who have many opinions about existence. He came home to Helen, who looked at him across all of it with eyes that had never once looked away from the truth of who he was, and loved him anyway. Not despite what she knew, but with it, the whole complicated, costly, trying to be better weight of him. The walls were down, all of them, permanently, joyfully, irreversibly down. And the light just poured straight in. That's the story of the woman who stood up in the rain and the man who could not look away. If this story found you somewhere real today, if it gave you something you needed, please like, share it with someone, and subscribe. We'll be here, telling the stories that remind us what it looks like when people choose each other. See you in the next one.